This is the Compaq v4435nr, a late Windows XP laptop from 2006. Compaq by this point had effectively become the budget version of HP, and rather unsurprisingly, the V4000 is the cheaper version of the HP Pavilion DV4000. In this case, the only difference is that the DV4000 has a slightly larger hard drive and also has a higher price tag to match. Otherwise, they are exactly the same computer, even down to the same motherboard layout and everything. The Presario V4000 line of Compaq laptops appears to have released around April 2005, and while I wasn't able to find this specific one on HP's old website, I did find this exact model on Best Buy's old website, debuting in around April of 2006 for $879.99. For that money, you got an Intel Pentium M 735 CPU clocked at 1.7 GHz, and Intel GMA 900 graphics, 512 MB of RAM, an 80 GB 4200 RPM hard drive, DVD-RW drive, 15.4-inch display, and of course, Windows XP. Though it is technically Vista capable, but on this kind of hardware, I think you can imagine how well that would go. Rather unsurprisingly, this computer uses a similar color scheme to Compaq's desktops around the time, being this black and silver combo. It almost looks like an Oreo. Pretty much all other Compaq laptops that were sold at this time used this exact same design, and it's fairly boring, but I don't really mind it at all. But the lid is this black plastic, with a bit of a rough texture, almost looking like a chalkboard. It practically scratches about as easy as one too. Outside of that, the computer's in pretty good shape. On the front of the laptop we have LEDs for power on, battery charge, and hard drive activity, the built-in speakers, and the latch for the display, which I should point out is rather firm on this device, so it requires quite a bit of force to actually close the lid. On the right side of the laptop we have the DVD-RW drive, headphone and microphone jacks, two USB 2.0 ports, VGA port without the screws, which is a little disappointing, S-Video port, and the Kensington lock slot. On the back we have the cooling vent, and on the left side of the laptop we have the DC jack, which rather annoyingly is an 18.5 volt smaller jack than what you would expect on most DC-19 laptops because HP just had to be that way. We also have the connector for the modem, as well as Ethernet, HP's own expansion port, which I find rather fascinating on a consumer laptop, two more USB 2.0 ports, mini FireWire port, a 6-in-1 card reader, and an express card slot, and a PCMCIA slot. The palm rest of the laptop has the I/O marked on the side, so you have a general idea of where it is. Up top we have the power, Wi-Fi, and volume toggles. All of these buttons have LEDs in them, with the exception of the volume up and down toggles. However, none of them work anymore due to a bad wire in this power board. However, the buttons still work fine. It's just that they don't light up at all. There's also a Compaq Ergo sticker, and the sleep switch for the display. The keyboard on this thing actually isn't painted, it's white plastic, so it can yellow over time, as you can see with some of the keys looking yellower than others. Otherwise, it's a fairly typical layout that you would expect from an HP machine, with a separate row of keys on the right side, and media controls if you use the function key. Otherwise, the keyboard's okay, but I find it to be really uncomfortably stiff. It requires a lot of force to actually make a key press, and I found myself making a lot of typing errors on this thing. Maybe it's something to do with this machine's age, but I find that my DV4000 keyboard is exactly the same way, so I could probably get used to it, but coming off of other laptops, I find it a bit strange and I don't really like it. The The touchpad below it is fine, it gets the job done, and it's quite big for a laptop of the time. My only complaint is that the buttons used rubber. Like, not even a rubber coating, just straight up rubber. Unsurprisingly, this rubber does not age well, and this computer was disgusting, so these rubber buttons were practically brown when I got the system. So I ended up just ripping it all off down to just bare plastic. Even the inserts that the rubber sat on were just so gross that I just ripped them all out, so it's down to just the bare layer. It doesn't look that great, but it works fine, it's just cosmetic. And of course, there's also the Windows XP and Intel Centrino stickers. As mentioned previously, this has a 15.4-inch 1280 by 800 display that is glossy, which is unfortunate. It's just kind of fine. This one's pretty dim because the backlight has worn over time, but otherwise, it's fine. I don't really have a lot of complaints about it. There's also the Presario branding, and in case you didn't know already, this computer wants you to know that it's a widescreen. Also, something that doesn't really matter, but is something that I noticed, is that both the Compaq and Presario logos are just slightly off-centered, and I'm definitely not very annoyed by it. On the bottom of the laptop, we have the battery, which while original is totally dead. Below that, we have the hard drive cover, which exposes the aforementioned 80GB 4200 RPM original hard drive to this computer. Or is it? Because it has a manufacture date of 2007. The original optical drive to this machine is also the same way. Maybe this computer was serviced under warranty at some point. Underneath this cover is also the screw for the optical drive, or, well, it would be there, except the bracket was shorting out the motherboard on the system, so it wasn't detecting an optical drive right. And, well, this is actually a replacement drive, same model and everything, just the original was having issues reading disks, and I happen to have this one laying around. Next to that, we have the door for the RAM and Wi-Fi card. This PC was actually upgraded by the previous owner to 2GB of DDR2 RAM, the most that this computer supports. And this also has an Intel 2200BG Wi-Fi chip. Under that Wi-Fi card is where the CMOS battery would go, however it was completely dead, and next to that is also the connector for the speakers. And rather surprisingly for an HP product, you can actually get at the CPU heatsink without having to dismantle the whole device. Granted, it's being screwed down with a Torx screw, even though the rest of the laptop is Phillips screws, but I guess something is better than nothing. The heatsink on this thing is fairly small, but it's a fairly unexciting chip, so it's not really that surprising. And it means that you can repaste the CPU and clean out the dust without having to take apart the whole computer, so that is a plus. And it does mean that while you can't get at the cooling fan, you could get at pretty much everything you need to just from the bottom of the computer without having to dismantle the entire thing, which honestly isn't really something to complain about. There's also the Windows XP Home Edition product key and the HP information, and the spots for the rubber feet, which are all gone on this computer, so it just slides all over a desk. And that's about it, but honestly, good job HP from 20 years ago. I should mention that after many years of use, the bearings on the cooling fan are starting to go out, so it doesn't sound that great sometimes, but honestly, fan noise on this computer is relatively low in the first place, and depending on the surface you have it on, you really wouldn't notice that at all. Unsurprisingly, since that CMOS battery is gone, the BIOS resets its settings every time the system loses power, which is fairly easy since the main battery is dead. That being said, there's hardly any BIOS settings to change anyway, as typical for an HP device. The BIOS is version F.21, the latest release from 2007. You can set a hard drive password in addition to the usual options you would get. You can change the amount of video memory available. You can set an F10 startup delay, change the boot order, enable or disable the Wi-Fi device, and run a hard drive test. And that is it. That is all that the system has. And of course, there's also the boot menu. And this computer, unsurprisingly, is running Windows XP. However, I did not get the original installation with this computer. So what I've done instead is my own installation, and I found a Compaq application recovery disk for this computer. Out of the box, this would have shipped with the silver theme, which I guess fits the computer well. However, I've installed the Zune theme instead on this system, since I just feel like it fits the wallpaper a little bit better with its orange accents. The application driver disk has its own setup utility like that Elite book that I got earlier this year, so you actually have the choice of picking the things you want to install, so you don't have to install all of the pre-installed applications and garbage. For example, if you didn't want Norton 2005, well, you could just unselect it. I should point out that this disk I found is from when the V4000 first came out in April of 2005, so a lot of the drivers that are included on this disk are freaking ancient. And rather unusually for a consumer device, especially from HP, there is very little bloatware installed on this computer. Possibly that's because this disk is so old, or it's because this was supposed to be the budget system and so doesn't have nearly as many preloaded things, but I do know that my DV4000 has a lot more junk installed out of the box than this did. It comes with HP's own software update program, a copy of InterVideo WinDVD 5, an old copy of iTunes 4, this movie auto producer software, the aforementioned Norton Internet Security 2005. I've always wondered if these old antivirus solutions that ship with these OEM PCs can still update at all, and it turns out, at least for Norton, you actually can. There's also an old version of QuickTime on this system because of iTunes, this Sonic digital media software, Zone.com Deluxe Games, no wild tangent on this system, and Adobe Reader 6.0. And that's it. So frankly, I don't really have any complaints at all. None of the software is particularly intrusive. There's also a couple shortcuts to various HP things on the desktop, but overall, it's a fairly light software load. Again, it's possible that different configurations or newer versions would have had more things installed on it, but personally, I like it in this configuration. Of course, I have made my own modifications. I installed Microsoft Office on this solely because there is surprisingly no Office solution that was installed out of the box, which is practically rare on a consumer PC. Now it's time for my usual tests. First of all, web browsing, which, well, unsurprisingly isn't very good on here. In fact, I actually can't get it to work at all. Which is a bit strange because I got it to work earlier in my testing, but when I actually went to get my footage for this video, well, it just wasn't working. I should point out that the Wi-Fi card on this computer is kind of crap, so it likes to drop the connection after a while, or it will connect with an extremely weak signal, and that seems to be what's happening here. But both Supermium and an emergency installation of Firefox just did nothing, which I find a bit bizarre, so you have to take my word for it. It's not pleasant. Unsurprisingly, the CPU on this thing struggles the hardest. And while it's okay for basic stuff, it's not great outside of that. Now, even though this isn't a gaming device at all, I was a little curious to see how this computer would do with some old games. And well, it's definitely not pretty. Perhaps I need a better selection of old games to try, but at least with the few that I ran on this computer, something more intensive like Flatout is playable, but the frame rate is so inconsistent that it quickly gave me a headache. It's both simultaneously better and worse than the Radeon Express 200 graphics from the Pavilion A1206N. During this time, temperatures for the CPU seemed to peak at around 75 to 80 degrees. Probably because the CPU fan only kicks in faster at around that temperature. It should also be noted that even when the CPU is running hot, the rest of the base is fairly cool to the touch, so if you're using it on a desk, you really wouldn't notice on most places you'd actually touch the system. Of course, more basic games are playable on the system, like SimCity 4, It actually seemed to be able to handle the Big City tutorial better than the A1206N did, since it didn't crash. Something the system does have, though, is fairly good speakers, actually.
Welcome back.
They're not even really that blown either. I'm actually fairly impressed. Where I'm not impressed is the optical drive. It's fairly quiet, I guess, but it's hardly the quickest thing I've ever seen. In everyday use, it's actually very slow. It's supposed to be rated for 32x CD speed and 8x DVD speed, and it doesn't get anywhere near that. It works fine, it gets the job done, but outside of that, it's just not really that great. Speaking of not that great, the hard drive. Rather unsurprisingly, for a 4200 RPM drive, the read and write speeds aren't great. It has some reallocated sectors, so its life is limited, but it also has quite a lot of hours on it for a laptop drive. Otherwise, this computer would be better served with a faster hard disk or flash media solution. So in conclusion, it's okay. The performance is relatively unexciting. When this computer was new, it was practically obsolete, as Intel had pretty much come out with the Core Duo and Core 2 Duo CPUs around the same time that this was new, and AMD obviously had better offerings. I'd imagine HP was probably trying to get rid of old stock. The V4000 line appears to have disappeared around mid-2006 and replaced with newer and better options. I think it's emphasized by the fact that upgrade options for this are relatively limited. It could take a faster CPU, but there's very little point. It can't take more than 2 gigs of RAM. It could take a faster disk drive. And as we've already determined on this channel several times, Intel effectively abandoned this chipset less than a year after this computer was made. And its performance on any newer version of Windows is frankly not good. This model and other similar Compaq models can also be found for relatively cheap, but as always, there are almost usually better options out there.